Orleans Humanist Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello again. I'm Harry Greenberger. I'm the president of the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association and the host for this show for many, many years. We have as our guest today John Barry, who also was on our program not too long ago. But we discussed, and I promised John that I'd have him on when his new book was published. It is now available. It has been published. John, let him take a look at your book. And then I think that people would like to know and remember that this isn't the first book you have written. Tell us about the other books, and then we want to talk about your new book.
Well, in the New Orleans area, I guess I'm best known for Rising Tide, about the Mississippi River flood in 1927, and because of that, I'm on the Flood Protection Authority and the State Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority.
So in writing that book, you made yourself like an expert in floods and that.
Well, I certainly learned something about them, and I think my role on we still call it the levee board, but my role is probably, I know a lot of people in the national media, so and I can write op-ed pieces and things like that, so I have access to them. We have, of course, engineers on the board who are considerably more expert in the actual dynamics of levee construction and things like that than I am.
All right, that's one of your earlier books. You have another one that was very successful as well.
I've got, this is actually my sixth book. The one you're probably talking about would be about, it's called The Great Influenza, about the 1918
The influenza, which then made you an expert in medical matters, right?
Well, I've gotten involved in a lot of the planning for preparedness for a pandemic. It was based on events in 1918 and how cities reacted to that outbreak when worldwide between 50 and 100 million people died. So because I was familiar with what places did in 1918, I got involved in that stuff. But for I've worked on this book for 8 years, and for that whole time I told people that I may write a book that is a disaster, but I'm never writing about one again.
Well, when you say how long you've been writing on the book, I have had contact with you, mostly email, for over a year, but maybe longer, because someone had told me, and by the way, John spends part of his year living in New Orleans, but
most of it in New Orleans.
Someone told me that you were writing a book regarding separation of church and state, and I said, all right, that's the man I want to talk to. Yeah. And so our emails over the period of time said, well, when my book is published, I'll be ready. And so that's how we got you back here today. All right, tell us something about Roger Williams and your book.
Well, the main thing to understand is that the First Amendment did not come out of theory. It didn't come from people sitting around the room brainstorming. It came as a specific response to specific historic events. And what this book really covers is the events that led to the First Amendment. And Roger Williams is generally generally credited with the idea of separating church and state, sort of the father of the idea, although it actually goes back before him. And that's true. He's gets less credit for even more revolutionary statements about politics. And the first part of this book is set in England, and the influences on him are really extraordinary. Probably very few people outside of a couple of lawyers maybe in your audience ever heard of Edward Coke, but Edward Coke was Chief Justice of England. He's a person who said, the house of everyone is as his castle. And what he was saying in that ruling, it was a ruling from the bench, was that all the rights and liberties of a great lord of England who had a castle, not a rhetorical flourish, but a physical fortress and a great army, legally the same liberties applied to the lowest commoner in England who had a hut. And that was really an extraordinary statement of English about individual liberty, and he was the mentor of Roger Williams.
As I understand it, when you're talking about the castle, the authority to rule a government presumably came from God, I think.
At that time, everybody pretty much believed, except for...
And so Roger Cook was then said, we all have the same authority. Everyone's home is his castle. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, Cook would have agreed that the authority for government came from God. However, in terms of the law, he was really responsible for codifying common law. He's an enormously important judge. Principles from, he set precedents including prohibition of double jeopardy in trials, judicial review of legislative acts. He was a huge figure. And he was sent to the King James and King Charles were trying to inject the idea of absolute power of the monarch into English history, and Cook stood up to them. The result in the end of this conflict was the English Civil War and the beheading of the king. But before that happened, Cook, as I say, was standing up for English liberty, and there was tremendous tension over religion because James and his son Charles were trying to move the Church of England toward Catholic style worship. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, give you an example of how much King James got into the details. The reason the King James Bible exists is because there was already an English Bible, but James didn't like it because it did not teach enough obedience to authority. He ordered a new translation of the Bible because he wanted one to teach people to obey authority and not to resist authority at all.
And that's the Bible that is in regular common usage today.
That's correct, the King James Bible, and for the last 400 years. And so Williams has this idea of individual liberty because he's a protege of Cook. They had a father-son relationship. And another influence on him was Francis Bacon, who was the father of the modern scientific method. And Bacon and Cook despised each other, but Williams took from Bacon his ideas that you need evidence, that not only do you rely on evidence, but that you have to test the evidence, you form a hypothesis, you run experiments. So those were two influences on Williams, and the third was Scripture itself. Williams was not a secularist, much less an atheist. He was a devout Puritan minister. He was considered so godly that when he arrived in Boston, he was offered the ministry of the Boston Church, which was the greatest post of its kind in America. And he declined because he thought that church was not pure enough for him. However, in his reading of Scripture, anybody who reads Scripture understands you run across contradictory passages. In addition, he was a linguist, read the Bible in many languages. And when you layer the contradictory passages on top of that, different translations, he understood that it was impossible for anyone to interpret all of Scripture without error. And because you can't interpret it without error, then who are you or who is anyone to force somebody else to believe in your interpretation, to follow your interpretation?
And being a Puritan meant exactly what?
Well, they were basically Calvinists theologically, and believed in predestination, that was, I guess, sort of the essential
Just as
element.
an aside, the Prime Minister of Australia is quoted as having said, "I'm glad that America got the Puritans and we got the criminals."
Oh. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, Williams and John Winthrop, who preach a sermon from which the phrase "city on a hill" comes, were friends, but also sort of represent the two archetypes, or maybe competing strands, of American history. And right from the beginning of American history, you have these two different visions. The idea of the chosen people and founding a Christian nation, which came out of Winthrop. And Williams had a different idea of what the city on a hill was. To Williams, it was freedom. So these two strands sort of intertwine and compete for the right to the, like two strands of DNA, wrapped around each other right to the present, and sort of define this tension in America between freedom and this idea of us as a Christian nation.
The tension which is exhibiting itself today.
Every day that we've been in existence as a nation, pretty much. But
hasn't it been sort of accelerated or actually?
I think it has been accelerated. Probably it got kicked off in a big way 50 years ago when the Supreme Court banned school prayer. And then in the 70s, of course, Falwell formed the moral majority, and evangelical Christians have gotten very active, of course, in the Republican Party. They try to determine who the Republican nominee is. They're obviously a major force in that party. And the tension in Louisiana is a state where we have those conflicts on a daily basis.
Absolutely, and we have a state legislature who are so timid that when any bill comes before them to vote on that has anything to do that involves maybe church-state separation or creationism or the public education system, they will all support the intrusion of religion. It's almost unanimous every time one of those bills comes up. And we know that they don't all, that's not the philosophy of all of these people.
They're politicians, and politicians aren't known for courage. Although in their defense, Disraeli said the first requisite for statesmanship is to get elected.
And the second is to get reelected.
Yeah. But Williams, as I said, he's a devout Puritan minister. But he also said forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. And he called forced worship spiritual rape. He felt very strongly that the separation of church and state had to be absolute and totally complete. And ironically, he wanted to do it primarily to protect the church, because he understood whenever you mix religion and politics, you get politics. But to protect the purity of the idea of God, how shall I put it? He thought it was, many of those who want God back in government, feel that government must protect God, yeah. must help the church.
You're talking about the United States government?
Yeah,
okay.
or anywhere in the world for that matter. We're not the only country with the issue. But Williams recognized that if the government is going to get involved in religion, then somebody in the government is going to have to be making a judgment about something to do with God. And to a devout man such as he, this was not only offensive, it was sacrilegious. He didn't think people were supposed to judge God. God's supposed to judge people. So therefore, he felt the only way to avoid this was to completely separate the two.
And taking that position got him into serious trouble in the colonies.
Yes, it did. He was banished from Massachusetts and forced to flee for his life. And he ended up founding Providence as it became the freest society in the world. And interestingly, when he wrote the governing compact for Providence, unlike the governing compact for every other colony in the Americas, whether it was English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese, every other one said, we're founding this colony to advance God's glory, to build the Christian religion. In Providence, in the first draft of the compact, he asked for God's blessing, and then he even, in the final draft, he actually took out the request for God's blessing because he felt government had to be completely, totally secular. And similarly, as I'm sure you know, in the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration refers to a creator, but the Constitution refers to no entity that could pass for God. It does ask for a blessing, but that's the blessings of liberty.
And they say that our government is founded upon the agreement of we the people.
Yes.
As opposed to the church.
And then I'm sure you know, 8 years after the Constitution, the Senate unanimously passes a treaty which includes the sentence, the government of the United States is in no way founded on the Christian religion.
That's correct, and signed by the president.
Right.
Back to the concept of, you mentioned common law in England, which was not how England, the government operated, but did he then utilize common law, and is that the basis for our Constitution?
Well, part of it. Cook, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote something called the Petition of Right, which Parliament passed unanimously. This was in conflict with the King. And 4 of the amendments of the Bill of Rights come straight out of the Petition of Right. The habeas corpus clause, one of the things Cook did was pioneer the use of habeas corpus to protect individual liberties. We have that clause in the Constitution. So this idea of liberty certainly informs not only Williams, but the American Constitution. Common law is a little bit more complicated, but that certainly comes out of the common law tradition.
Now, back in the colonial days that we're talking about, where every colony, at least the New England colonies, with the exception of what he did in Rhode Island, they were religious governments. However, as I read in your book and elsewhere, not that many people went to church.
Well, they went to church, but they had to by law, but they weren't full members of the church. It was not easy to become a full-fledged member of a church in Puritan, Massachusetts. We don't know the precise numbers, but it is somewhere between 15 and 30% of the population were church members, although all of them had to attend church services by law, or they would be fined and then whipped, and probably on some occasions imprisoned if they were really
laggard. Well, I don't think anyone would want to get whipped, but you know, from what I've read, that they may have been going to church, but they were not necessarily that religious in that colonial time.
Well, that's hard to say, honestly. It was quite difficult to become a member of a church. It was a very rigorous process. You didn't simply say, I want to join, and you were accepted. And the fact that people were not members of the church is not necessarily, you can't jump to the conclusion that they were less religious necessarily. Some of them may not have, if they felt doubt as to their own holiness or something like that, they might not, if they didn't feel worthy, they wouldn't even seek membership, but they might be deeply religious.
All right. Well, so when he was banned from Massachusetts and started his own group in Providence,
Right.
which is now Rhode Island, what kind of governing and what kind of people did he have around him there?
Well, he, not surprisingly, attracted people who believed in freedom as he did. As a result, Rhode Island was referred to as the latrina of America, where all the rebels gathered. But Rhode Island also passed the first law anywhere in the world outlawing slavery in 1652. Not only he believed in freedom, but as I say, the people who went to Rhode Island tended to share his views. And again, many of these people, in those days, almost all of them were probably believers in God, many of them quite devout. The Baptist, it was the only colony in America, or for that matter, it was the only place where a Baptist couldn't worship openly in England without going to jail, but they could in Rhode Island, so Baptists went there.
And when you mention abolishing or having a law against slavery, the slaves there, as I understand, were not all Africans. They had...
No. The idea of slavery in the 17th century was quite different. The racial tinge didn't apply, for one thing, because every time an Englishman got on a boat, a ship, he was at risk for being captured and sold into slavery himself. John Smith, who's the captain, one of the founders of Virginia and a very famous figure, Captain John Smith, he was enslaved. So Indians were enslaved. The Irish were virtually enslaved when they were captured and became servants, indentured servants. So that racial gap developed later. There was already some, but not as developed, excuse me, in the next century.
And so when his concept of liberty meant individual liberty, they couldn't have a master.
There was a term, and it couldn't run for more than 10 years, which was basically the same as an indentured servant. I think the other thing that's important to understand about Williams is just the idea of political liberty. He was the first person in the world, or at least in the modern world, I don't know enough ancient history to know whether somebody said it back then, but he was the first in the modern world to link political freedom and religious freedom. And you were saying earlier that everyone back then thought authority from government came from God. Even Winthrop, who was elected governor of Massachusetts, immediately after being elected, told the people who just voted for him, though chosen by you, our authority comes from God. And this was not an offensive statement, because all the people who voted for him agreed with that. And if anything, it was reassuring, the idea that, but Williams, since he believed that government was entirely secular, obviously its authority could not come from God. So where could it come from? And he said, I infer the original sovereign power comes from the people, and governments have no power, nor for a longer time, than the people consenting betrust them with.
Now, those elected officials from the colonial times who expressed great belief in a supernatural power, I believe that they were probably sincere. Today, our politicians who do the same thing are pandering to get votes. Would you agree with that?
I don't want to put myself in anybody's head. So would I think that some of them are? Yeah. But do I think others are sincere? Yeah, I think they probably are.
Oh, there are some. I don't question that. Now, how did we get from the colonies, which did not have a church-state separation situation, with the exception of what happened in Providence and Rhode Island, How did that get to become the national into the national constitution?
I think there are 4 routes through which Williams's ideas got into present day. First, he was an example. Everyone, when we fought our revolution, knew he was America's first contradictor of power, America's first rebel. Second, he went back to London, became an enormously influential figure. He went back to London several times during the English Revolution. He influenced John Milton, he influenced Oliver Cromwell, he had tremendous impact on John Locke, and all of the founders and fathers, certainly if they didn't read Williams, they all read John Locke. In addition, ironically, after the restoration of the throne in England, King Charles II confirmed Rhode Island's charter with total separation of church and state and total freedom, religious freedom. But he subsequently chartered other colonies, and although those other colonies had an established Church of England in them, he took the same language from the Rhode Island Charter and put them in the charters of these other colonies, that there would be no persecution for religious conscience. So even though there was an established church linked to the government, there was still the idea of religious freedom. And the fourth way is in 1776, 2 biographies of Williams came out, one of them by one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So these ideas were already circulating, and right at the timing of our revolution, Williams is sort of rekindled as an ideal.
John, we're almost out of time, but I do want to let the audience know that those of you who are watching this show this month, February, that John is going to be addressing our organization the last Saturday of this month. And what is the title of your talk for that meeting?
I have.
It's all right.
The Birth of Liberty, probably. Church.
Right. Which I think people will find very interesting. And the book, which we have right here, is presently available at bookstores and other places. And what it says here, Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty. So, John, we really appreciate your being here with us.
Okay. Thank you.
We're probably going to want to have you around again because you're the expert on a topic that we are greatly interested in. You have a couple of words you want to let our audience know before we have to go?
I think I've covered it. Thanks.
All right. Well,
I don't speak in a couple of words.
Well, I have heard that about you before, and it has been a real pleasure having John here, and been a pleasure having you folks watch our show. We hope to see you again next week.